The world as we know it changed on a single night in March 2026. Not slowly, not gradually. In one devastating moment, missiles streaked across the Persian skies, oil markets collapsed into chaos, leaders across 6 continents scrambled to their war rooms. And in Washington, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States looked directly into the camera and said 5 words that the entire world will not forget. This could be a long war. Welcome back. You're watching a channel that does not flinch from the truth. Today, we are breaking down the most explosive geopolitical crisis of the decade, the US-Israel strikes on Iran, the global oil catastrophe that followed, and how world powers are now drawing new battle lines across the globe. Stay with us. Every second of this video matters. To understand the full weight of what is happening right now, we need to go back. Not years, not decades, just days. In the early hours of a Saturday morning, the combined military forces of the United States and Israel launched one of the most coordinated aerial assaults in modern history. According to intelligence analysts and multiple defense tracking organizations, more than 1,039 separate attack runs were recorded across 504 confirmed sites inside Iranian territory. The targets were not chosen randomly. They were selected with surgical precision: nuclear enrichment facilities, ballistic missile storage depots, air defense networks, and, crucially, the command and control infrastructure of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the iron fist of the Iranian state. The result? At least 787 confirmed casualties in Iran. Entire military districts reduced to rubble. Iran's air defense network, once considered one of the most sophisticated in the region, left partially dismantled. But then came the moment that stopped the world cold. The supreme leader of Iran, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, the ideological cornerstone of Iranian resistance, was confirmed dead. Iran declared 40 days of national mourning, and the region held its breath. But Iran did not go quietly into the night. For decades, strategists have warned that Iran's greatest weapon is not its nuclear program. It is not its missiles. It is its network, a carefully constructed web of militias, proxies, and allied forces that stretch from the Lebanese mountains to the Yemeni coastlines, from the deserts of Iraq to the suburbs of Damascus. That network was activated. Iranian-backed militias launched coordinated retaliatory strikes targeting Israel, U.S. military installations, and allied Arab states across the region. The most alarming development? A missile strike, potentially from Iranian-backed forces operating in Kuwait, struck directly inside the perimeter of the U.S. Embassy compound. One of the most protected diplomatic buildings on Earth. Washington responded immediately. The U.S. president authorized the evacuation of American diplomatic personnel across multiple embassies throughout the Middle East. Some facilities were shut down entirely. This was not a drill. This was not a precaution. This was an emergency. And, as the smoke cleared over the Persian Gulf, one terrifying reality was becoming impossible to ignore. This conflict was no longer contained. Now, let's talk about something that will affect every single person watching this video, whether you live in New York, Lagos, Mumbai, or Berlin. Oil. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman, is the single most important waterway on the planet for global energy. Approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through it daily. When conflict erupts in this region, the world does not just watch. The world pays. Container shipping giant Maersk, one of the largest maritime transport companies on Earth, announced the suspension of all vessel crossings through the Strait of Hormuz until further notice. Other major shipping companies followed. The result was immediate and brutal. Brent crude oil prices hit a new 52-week high, surging past $78 per barrel, and analysts are warning this is just the beginning. If the strait remains disrupted for weeks, we could be looking at prices that break $100 per barrel and beyond. What does this mean for the average person on the street? Higher fuel prices, skyrocketing transportation costs, inflation creeping back into food prices, manufacturing costs, and your monthly bills. Economists are already issuing warnings about supply chain disruptions not seen since the pandemic era. This is not just a Middle Eastern crisis. This is a global economic earthquake, and its aftershocks are already being felt. While the world's eyes were locked on the Persian Gulf, something equally significant was happening 5,000 kilometers away, in Paris. The French president stepped before the nation and announced a decision that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. France will expand its nuclear weapons arsenal for the first time in decades. This announcement was not made in isolation. It was made in direct response to 3 seismic shifts in global security. First, Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine has shattered the post-Cold War European security consensus. The assumption that large-scale conventional warfare in Europe was a thing of the past has been violently disproven. Second, China's rapidly growing military power has alarmed not just the United States, but European capitals that once felt insulated from Pacific geopolitics. Third, and perhaps most politically sensitive, The changing defense priorities of the United States under its current administration have left European allies questioning whether the American security umbrella they have relied upon since 1945 is still as reliable as it once was. France's decision signals something profound. Europe is rearming. Europe is recalculating its dependency on Washington, and Europe is preparing for a world in which it may need to defend itself, alone. The post-World War II international order, the system of alliances, mutual defense treaties, and diplomatic frameworks that kept large-scale global conflict at bay for 80 years, is fracturing. Slowly, but unmistakably. And while the cameras of the world's media were pointed toward the Middle East and the halls of Paris, a massacre was unfolding in Africa that barely registered a mention on the front pages. In South Sudan's Ruwing administrative area, armed attackers launched a coordinated assault that killed at least 169 people. Among the dead were senior government officials. This is not a new story. South Sudan has been gripped by cycles of violence, ethnic conflict, and political instability since it gained independence in 2011. But 169 deaths in a single attack, including government officials, is not a skirmish. It is a signal. A signal that even as the world's attention is consumed by the Persian Gulf, other theaters of human tragedy continue to burn, unseen, underreported, and underfunded. The United Nations has responded with emergency calls for aid. Neighboring nations have been placed on alert. But with global attention and resources being directed toward the Middle East energy crisis, the question of whether South Sudan will receive the international support it desperately needs remains deeply uncertain. Let us now take a step back from the immediate battlefield and look at the larger chessboard. Because what is happening in March 2026 is not just a U.S.-Iran conflict. It is not just an oil crisis. It is the first true test of the post-American unipolar world. Russia is watching closely. With its military still deeply committed in Ukraine, Moscow cannot afford to open new fronts. But Russia has every strategic incentive to see oil prices spike, to see NATO allies destabilized, and to see American military resources stretched across multiple theaters simultaneously. The Kremlin has made no secret of its partnership with Tehran over recent years. China's position is more complex and arguably more consequential. Beijing is Iran's single largest oil customer. Chinese state energy companies have massive investments in Iranian infrastructure. Any escalation that permanently disrupts Iranian oil exports directly damages Chinese economic interests. At the same time, China has no desire to be drawn into open confrontation with the United States at this moment. Beijing has its own timeline, its own calculations about Taiwan, and its own reading of American resolve under the current administration. China's public position will be calls for restraint and diplomacy. China's private actions will be to deepen ties with Iran, accelerate de-dollarization of oil trade, and use this crisis as evidence to the developing world that American unilateralism is destabilizing. The global South, the vast collection of nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, is watching all of this with a mixture of alarm and calculation. Rising oil prices will devastate developing economies already struggling with debt, inflation, and food insecurity. For these nations, this is not an abstract geopolitical drama. This is a food crisis waiting to happen, a fuel crisis already underway, and a reminder that the decisions made in Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, Paris, Beijing, and Moscow are decisions that reverberate in every village, every market, and every home on Earth. There is one more story in this week's global crisis that deserves your attention, and it is one that most news outlets are bearing beneath the Middle East headlines. Denmark has called a snap election for March 24th. The trigger? The escalating geopolitical pressure surrounding Greenland. The massive Arctic island that controls strategic sea lanes, holds enormous untapped natural resources, and has suddenly become a flashpoint of global power competition. As climate change opens new Arctic shipping routes and makes the island's natural resources increasingly accessible, Greenland has transformed from a distant, frozen territory into one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. The Danish government's decision to call early elections signals that the Greenland issue has become domestically explosive, fracturing political coalitions, igniting nationalist sentiment, and forcing Copenhagen to make difficult choices about sovereignty, security, and its relationships with both NATO allies and the United States. In a world already on fire, quite literally, the battle for the Arctic is a slow-burning fuse that geopolitical analysts say could define the next decade of great power competition. So where does this all go from here? Let us be honest with you. No one, not the CIA, not the Pentagon, not Mossad, not the analysts at the world's top think tanks, can tell you with certainty how this ends. But here are the 4 scenarios that defense experts and geopolitical analysts are currently modeling. Scenario 1, controlled escalation with negotiated pause. Iran, despite the devastation, chooses strategic restraint. The death of its supreme leader triggers an internal power struggle that temporarily paralyzes decision-making in Tehran. Back-channel negotiations, potentially brokered by Qatar or Oman, begin quietly. Oil markets stabilize. The conflict remains brutal but geographically limited. Scenario 2, full regional war. Iran's proxy network escalates beyond the Gulf. Hezbollah opens a full northern front against Israel. Iraqi militias launch sustained attacks on U.S. bases. The Strait of Hormuz is actively mined or blockaded. Oil prices shatter historical records. The U.S. is drawn into a multi-front conflict that strains its military and economic capacity in ways not seen since the Second World War. Scenario 3, economic warfare and proxy stalemate. Neither side can achieve a decisive military victory. Iran bleeds. The U.S. faces domestic backlash over casualties and soaring fuel prices. A grinding proxy war settles in across the region, exhausting all parties, destabilizing Arab governments, and feeding extremist recruitment. This is the scenario historians call a forever war, and it is arguably the most likely. Scenario 4, escalation to nuclear threshold. This is the scenario no one wants to say out loud. Iran, stripped of conventional deterrence and facing existential regime threat, accelerates any remaining nuclear capabilities. The world crosses a threshold it has not approached since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This scenario remains low probability, but it is no longer off the table. We have talked about missiles and oil barrels. We have talked about nuclear arsenals and geopolitical chess moves. We have talked about the decisions of presidents and supreme leaders and foreign ministers. But before we close this video, we need to talk about something else. People. Behind every single data point in this crisis is a human being. The 787 Iranians killed in the strikes, they had families, they had children. They had entire lives that mattered to people who loved them. The Kuwaiti civilians living near the U.S. embassy when the missile struck, they did not choose this conflict. It arrived on their street. The South Sudanese families who lost 169 of their neighbors and community members in a massacre, the world buried on page 14. The Yemeni father, who can't understand why a war fought for strategic interests thousands of miles away, has put his children in danger again. The Indian factory worker, whose wage, already stretched thin, will now have to cover fuel that costs more because tankers can't safely pass through a strait on the other side of the world. Geopolitics is not a game. It is the lived reality of billions of human beings who wake up every morning hoping for peace, stability, and the chance to build a better life for their families. And it is our collective responsibility as citizens, as voters, and as human beings to understand what is happening, demand accountability from our leaders, and refuse to look away. The world is on fire. That isn't rhetoric. That is the reality of March 2026. The United States has struck Iran. Iran's supreme leader is dead. Oil markets are in crisis. France is expanding its nuclear arsenal. South Sudan is bleeding. Denmark is heading to the polls over the future of the Arctic. And the global powers, the US, China, Russia, and Europe, are all recalculating their positions in a world order that is shifting beneath their feet in real time. The question is no longer whether the world is changing. The question is, what kind of world are we building in its place? And the answer to that question will be written not just in the offices of presidents and generals, but in the choices made by you and billions like you in the days, months, and years ahead. If this video gave you clarity on what's truly happening in the world, smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to understand the stakes, and subscribe for clear-eyed, no-nonsense geopolitical analysis every single week. We cover what others ignore, we explain what others complicate, and we will never stop watching the world on your behalf. Until next time, stay informed, stay aware, and stay awake.